Usage 1. Committing to refrain from doing a specific action. Examples: I promise not to smoke cigarettes anymore. I promise not to eat junk food for a month. I promise not to interrupt you during our conversation. I promise not to disclose your secret to anyone. I promise not to use my phone while driving. Usage 2. Assuring someone of one's intentions. Examples: I promise not to let you down. I promise not to forget your birthday this time. I promise not to make the same mistake again. I promise not to be late for our meeting. I promise not to break your trust. Usage 3. Giving an assurance or guarantee. Examples: I promise not to reveal your identity to anyone. I promise not to reveal the surprise until the right moment. I promise not to disclose the confidential information. I promise not to share your personal details with others. I promise not to use your ideas without giving you credit. Usage 4. Making a commitment to change or improve. Examples: I promise not to procrastinate and start working on it right away. I promise not to let fear hold me back from pursuing my dreams. I promise not to take your kindness for granted. I promise not to repeat the same mistake in the future. I promise not to let negativity affect my mindset. Usage 5. Vowing to uphold a specific behavior or attitude. Examples: I promise not to judge others based on their appearance. I promise not to lose my temper in difficult situations. I promise not to give up on my goals and aspirations. I promise not to take things for granted and appreciate every moment. I promise not to let failure discourage me from trying again. Sample sentences: I promise not to interrupt you while you're speaking. I promise not to eat any more sweets today. I promise not to share your personal information with anyone. I promise not to be late for our meeting tomorrow. I promise not to forget to pick up milk on my way home. I promise not to tell anyone about your surprise party. I promise not to use your laptop without permission. I promise not to let you down in this project. I promise not to gossip about others behind their backs. I promise not to skip my workout sessions this week. I promise not to cancel our plans at the last minute. I promise not to break any of the house rules. I promise not to leave dirty dishes in the sink. I promise not to play music too loudly late at night. I promise not to spend more than my budget allows. I promise not to take advantage of your kindness. I promise not to give up on my dreams, no matter what. I promise not to let negative thoughts consume me. I promise not to procrastinate on important tasks. I promise not to make the same mistake again. I promise not to judge others based on their appearance. I promise not to use my phone while driving. I promise not to criticize you without understanding your perspective. I promise not to let fear hold me back from taking risks. I promise not to let stress affect my relationships. I promise not to disclose your secret to anyone. I promise not to invade your privacy. I promise not to take your love and support for granted. I promise not to let jealousy ruin our friendship. I promise not to use offensive language in our conversations. I promise not to lose my temper during disagreements. I promise not to make decisions without considering the consequences. I promise not to neglect my responsibilities. I promise not to give in to peer pressure. I promise not to make promises I cannot keep. I promise not to betray your trust. I promise not to hold grudges and forgive easily. I promise not to ignore your needs and feelings. I promise not to let success change who I am. I promise not to take our friendship for granted. I promise not to let failure discourage me from trying again. I promise not to cheat in any situation. I promise not to skip my regular dental checkups. I promise not to miss any important deadlines. I promise not to break any traffic rules while driving. I promise not to use any harmful substances. I promise not to let others dictate my happiness. I promise not to give up on our relationship when things get tough. I promise not to betray your confidence. I promise not to let negative experiences define my future.